I now want to ask you about some of the specifics required to apply for a Mercury US bank account.
Yep.
Do you need a formal US entity, or can you apply for a Mercury account without having a US company?
The formal US entity that's like probably the main like core requirement. So you do have to have an EIN number and kind of like a document that can verify that number, be it like a letter 147C or like a screenshot from the IRS or your SS4 application, just like some document to show that you have that US EIN and are incorporated here.
To recap that's a common question we get asked. Do you need an EIN to open a US Mercury account? Sounds like the answer is yes. And just so I understand, and so folks do, some of those things you mentioned are essentially letters or documents that verify that one, you have an EIN, and two, that EIN is tied to your company. Is that accurate?
That is accurate, yes. So we require that kind of like, proof of EIN as well as company formation documents. So like an article of incorporation or a certificate of formation or other articles of organization.
In terms of applying for the Mercury bank account, can I apply to open an account on someone else's behalf? Or who actually is able to apply and open the account? Do you need to be a majority shareholder? Do you need to own an X% of the company? Are there any rules or guidelines there for folks?
Yeah, so we encourage people, actually, I don't know if it's an official like Mercury policy. I encourage people to apply on their own behalf when possible. There's not necessarily like an explicit rule about it. And we do have instances where like a lawyer or other service provider, for example, might apply on a company's behalf. And that is okay. And sometimes like that's, how people have their like system set up where, it might be a founder who's having their assistant do it or like, whatever. There are a lot of like ways in which like the actual founder might not be applying, and that's okay. What can happen though is, there can be the risk that it ends up looking like fraud in some way. So that's just like, that's something to be aware of. If like the applications are coming from like a bunch of different like IP addresses and people are logging in and off from like, there is account activity that can then be like perceived as fraud, which might slow the process down in some way or the other. But as long as the information is true and accurate, it doesn't matter who is like literally submitting it. It just has to be submitted properly.
Got it. In terms of documentation required for applying, if you are a US versus a non-US resident, what form of personal identification do you need, and why is that required as well?
Yeah, so the ID requirements are twofold. I mean, one is like for like general fraud, and then the other one is like very fundamental like US government stuff and like Patriot Act disclosures, which honestly, I'm not like extremely familiar with like truly like what the Patriot Act is, but it basically means that like we do need to have like the kind of know your customer verification as well as just like the know your business. Like, do you have the EIN documents right? And as part of that, you do need to submit a valid ID, in particular for people that aren't US citizens or with US ID, then a current passport is the necessary form of identification.
Got it. Sounds like there are bank policies, fraud review, US government policies that all play in here. If you're a non-US resident, a passport is required. If you're a US resident, passport or government ID is required.
Yes, like I would say, like a driver's license would be the most common, but there are other forms of ID that would also work.
Gotcha.
Like a permanent residency card or something else like that.
Okay. Hypothetical scenario. Let's say I apply for a Mercury bank account. I have my limited liability company or my C-corp. I am not a money services business, adult entertainment, gambling, marijuana. I'm an e-commerce business, or I'm a SaaS business, an Amazon seller, or an agency or consulting service.
Yep.
I have my EIN. I have my EIN verification letter, legitimate business. I applied and my application was denied. I submitted all the necessary forms and the application was denied. Is there anything someone can do if in the circumstance their Mercury account application is denied?
there is not a ton you can do. So one thing I'll say is we really don't want to deny applications. Like it's like antithetical to like our mission and to like our business and being able to make money. The more customers, the better for us. So depending on like what might be wrong with the application, like we're gonna like sort of do our best to resolve that issue, and our onboarding team will make follow-up requests. So in that way, it's like if it's like an information issue where there's like just a kind of like a missing question or a missing piece, then we might follow up with some questions that are often around like just verifying or better understanding the business. So sometimes people will apply with like a really light description on what the company is, and it might not be clear to the person reviewing the application like what the business is, and like if it's like a real business or like a real way of selling, depending on what's in the application. So we'll ask like, oh, like do you have a link to your website, or like can you like show what the storefront looks like, or can you describe the products that you're selling in more detail? We'll try to like verify those points. But again, like sometimes it does happen where you get rejected, and it's a bad experience, and it's tough once the decision is made to kind of like revert that. But we do have like people kind of reapply, and if it happens and you feel like it was an error and you feel like you kind of have information that can help make that decision, you can kind of like email in to help at Mercury and try to resolve that. But typically once that final decision's been made, it is tricky for us to change it.
Sounds like to me here, it's in Mercury's best interest to accept your application. And if there is any gap in communication or data entry, Mercury will reach out. They want to work with you. However, if the decision is made for either company type or company legitimacy or any of the reasons above, where fraud reasons, government reasons, etc., the company can't be opened, the decision is typically final there, and Mercury can't give additional detail. But Mercury is doing everything they can to ensure that the application can be approved in the first place.
Yeah,